I don't know if there we go. All right. Let me get situated. If you will come on in, we'll get started. We're going to be in the book of Acts, mainly in chapter 17 this morning, but Derek didn't quite finish up chapter 16 last week, so we will spend a few moments in chapter 16 before we get all the way into 17 this morning. I do want to add just kind of my thoughts on chapter 16 as a whole. I do think that is a very, very important chapter in the book of Acts for us to hold on to in our minds. To me, I think there are two very good examples of the conversion process that help us understand how essential baptism is in order to be saved. When Paul arrived in Philippi, of course, he didn't go to the synagogue. There appears to not be a synagogue in Philippi. He goes to where the women were praying, and so he converted Lydia. Now notice what Lydia did, what she said, and I think this is very important for us to see. Paul preached the gospel. She was baptized. Does anybody remember what she asked? She wanted to know, hey, if you have viewed me as being faithful, will you come to my house? So Paul goes to her house. What does that mean? The inspired apostle told Lydia by going to her house that she had met the conditions to become faithful, which included what? Baptism. Then you get later into the chapter and we have, of course, the Philippian jailer. This, I think, is a very important account for us to truly understand. So the earthquake happens, the jailer's worried about the prisoners escaping, and he says, Paul says, don't worry, we hadn't gone anywhere, right? And the jailer goes, what must I do to be saved? Now, what was he asking? Was he asking for physical salvation or spiritual salvation? I'm not sure. But Paul took it as an opportunity to talk to him about the actual spiritual salvation, the only salvation that matters. Now notice what Paul says in verse 31, and they said, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household. Many of our denominational friends stop right there. And this is a very, very big example in their repertoire, if you will. Okay? And they say, see, all you have to do is believe. Well, as we have said, what does this word believe mean throughout the New Testament, in particular in the book of Acts? Obedience. Well, how do I know that? This is a perfect example of that. Keep reading. Verse 32, and they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house, and he took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds. That would be really kind of his best way of showing his repentance. It was very rare for a soldier or a jailer to wash the wounds of a prisoner, but he was doing the best that he could to show his change of attitude, his change of life. And so he washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and all of his family. Now notice what the next verse says. Then he brought them up into his house and set food before them, and he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. What did he do to believe? He repented and he was baptized. And so I think these are two very, very good examples. Chapter 16 as a whole, really, I think is a very good one for all of us to understand and to keep in our mind's eye and be prepared to help other people see the truth. And I think this is a good one that does that. Now, Derek, stop there. Let's pick up reading in verse 35. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore come out now and go in peace. See, the magistrates, it seems, were desiring that Paul and Silas would just kind of disappear secretly almost. At least that's the way Paul took it. And that they would be completely done with all of this problems. We're in chapter 16. 16, 35, 36. Chapter 16, verse 35. Acts. Yeah. And now picking up in verse 37, but Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prisons. And do they now throw us out secretly? No. Let them come themselves and take us out. Paul is essentially asking for a public apology. Okay? Now, why was he doing this? So really, notice what he appealed to, that they had mistreated them, specifically their Roman citizenship. Paul, we know, is a Roman citizen, and it appears that Silas was as well. And so Paul appealed to that fact. It was wrong. Philippi was a Roman colony. It would have been wrong for a Roman to be punished without a trial. And that's what happened to Paul and Silas. And so he appeals to the legal code of the Romans in order to justify himself. That kind of teaches us something. We as Christians can appeal to the governing authorities in order to make our rights known. And I think that's important for us to understand. But notice, really, I think we need to appreciate why Paul is doing that. Was this a point of pride for Paul? I don't think it was. I think the reason that Paul did this was to help the new congregation that had been established in Philippi. I have for you a quote on the first slide. At the bottom it says, the demand that Paul was making was not merely a question of pride, rather it doubtless was for the benefit of the new congregation that would be left behind. In other words, just imagine, here are these two missionaries that had been beaten publicly, mistreated, and thrown in prison, and then all of a sudden they have disappeared and they're nowhere to be found. What would that do to the new followers of that religion? That would really leave them wide open to exposure. But here we have Paul stand his ground and let them know that, hey, we're not going to just be run over like this, okay? And so I think Paul really, again, we see his care for the brethren and his willingness to stand up for what is right, to help give them strength and comfort, if you will. And so verse 38, the police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. Why would that make the magistrates afraid? They broke the law when they beat a Roman citizen. And so they could have been held responsible and even punished themselves. Verse 39, so they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. I find that very interesting. Imagine you being beaten, you being mistreated, you being wrongfully imprisoned, and then you are the one that leaves and provides encouragement for others. Don't you think you're the one that would need encouragement in that situation? I would. But what does Paul do? Paul and Silas take it upon themselves to still provide encouragement to the new church that has been established there in Philippi. Now, before we leave Philippi, I do want to turn over to the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 1. If I could get there. Starting in verse 3, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you, all making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart. For you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in my defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. I just want to highlight that we are here these are the people that we're talking about that Paul grew to love for very much. We're talking about the Philippian jailer and his household. We're talking about Lydia and her household, and I'm sure others. But this congregation would go on to become one of Paul's favorites, and we just see the love that he had for these people. And it speaks to maybe his willingness to stand up there for the truth when he was there being asked to leave. And he said, no, I'm not going to leave them wide open for your persecution. And so again, we just see and appreciate Paul's love for the church. All right, moving on now to Acts chapter 17. Acts 17 verse 1. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. So in Philippi there appears that there was no synagogue, as I mentioned just a moment ago. But now we're back to an area that had at least, as what Josephus would say, they had to have at least 10 faithful Jewish men to have a synagogue. And so apparently in Thessalonica they had at least that many because there was a synagogue. Now, whenever there was a synagogue, what was Paul going to do? That's where he was going, right? And so we see that in verse 2. And Paul went in as was his custom. See, Luke points that out. We've seen it over and over and over. Where does Paul go? He goes to the people that already know about God, who are going to be most likely to appreciate what he has to say. And so he goes to the synagogue as was his custom. And on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. All right, several, I think, important things that we need to bring out here. We've seen a couple of sermons that have been provided by different people. Acts chapter 7, we think of Stephen, or 6. We think of Stephen, chapter 7, and his speech. Of course, some of Paul's sermons that we've seen. And I think we've seen some of what has been just laid out for us here. But what Luke just gave for us is a perfect outline for how we are to evangelize those who are lost. Notice what Paul did. First, he reasoned from the Scriptures. Does anybody remember Mr. Gary's devotional Wednesday night? Who can tell me what reasoned means? Debate. So that's one word that can be used in this instance. It carries the idea of debate. We're not talking about necessarily like a heated argument. That's what we think about. But the idea of debating means you are having a logical argument based off of evidence, and you're providing that argument. It's a defense, okay? And so that's what this idea of reasoned from the Scriptures carries along with it. Now, as I just said, where did he reason from? He reasoned from the Scriptures. Now from that, what did he do? He went on to explain and to prove. And so Paul would take the Old Testament Scriptures, specifically probably the ones about the Messiah or Jewish history, these types of things, and he would lay out these arguments in a very logical way. And he would explain them, and then he would prove his point. Now, what does that idea of proving mean? It means to lay alongside. And so Paul would take the evidence that is provided right here. He would take these Old Testament Scriptures and he would lay them down beside what? The life of Jesus. And he would point out how they match up. See, he fulfilled this. See, he fulfilled this. See, he's not in the grave anymore. And then what would he do? He would proclaim. Notice what he says. This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. He's the Messiah. And so he would reason, he would explain, he would prove, and then he would proclaim. Now I have a question for you, all of you in here. Can you do that? Can you reason from the Scriptures? Can you explain them? Can you prove what you believe? And do you proclaim it? I cannot answer for you. I can only answer for myself. I do know this. I wonder how many of us can reason from the Scriptures. Can we support what we believe? Or is it more along the lines, well, I know this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I've done my whole life, so that's what I'm going to do. What do you think? Paul gives us a very good example of how we're going to change the world. We have to be able to do these things. We have to be able to reason, explain, prove, and proclaim. Now, implied in this is an important lesson. Christianity is logical, it is provable, and it is explainable. One of my pet peeves is when somebody says you just have to take a leap of faith. Especially in reference to Christianity. That is false. Christianity, believing in God, is not a leap of faith. It is provable. It is also logical. And all of us in here need to be able to explain that. We need to be able to prove the existence of God. We need to be able to prove why Jesus is the Messiah. We need to be able to prove why baptism is essential for salvation. All of these various things. You know why? We have kids graduate high school that cannot tell you why we need to be saved. How we need to be saved. We have them. And you know why? It's our fault as parents. And so our kids need to know this. They're only going to learn it from us. They're not going to learn it from Bible class. I mean, they may catch on to one or two things, but if they're not learning it at home, they're not going to get it. And so we have to be able to do what Paul did. He was able to reason, explain, prove, and proclaim. All right, verse 4. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. That would be some of the Jews. Some of the Jews were persuaded. That idea means they were convinced. They believed, even obeyed. And so some of these Jews that heard Paul reason from the Scriptures obeyed the gospel, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. So some of the Jews obeyed, but many of the Greeks and many of the women obeyed. Isn't it a terrible, terrible thing that Israel, the Jews, who were given the Old Testament Scriptures, so many of them rebelled against God and didn't see Jesus as the Messiah. But once again, we see just some of the Jews obeying the gospel. Verse 5, but the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out of the crowd. And so, once again, this is not the first time that we've seen the Jews respond in this way. They were jealous. What were they jealous of, you think? Right, they were probably jealous of the success that Paul and Silas were having from preaching the truth, right? We saw it with Jesus in his lifetime. The Jews were jealous. And then we see it now. The Jews were jealous of the response to the gospel being preached. And so when they did that, they took evil men from the rabble. This is basically saying they went to the bad part of town and found the worst people that they could get and paid them to come and cause problems and then blame it on Paul and Silas. And so that's what these Jews did. Specifically, they went and attacked the house of a disciple named Jason. I assume that's where Paul and Silas were staying. That's the only reason that makes sense in my head to why they would choose his house, because it appears that they were looking for Paul and Silas. Notice what verse 6 says. And when they could not find them, that being Paul and Silas, when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people of the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things, and when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So a couple of things to point out here as well. Notice the claim that the crowd made. These men who have turned the world upside down have come here. Isn't that amazing? Of course, they meant that in derision, right? They were not meaning that as a compliment, were they? They were basically calling them major troublemakers. They were saying everywhere they go, these men cause trouble. Well, really, when they tried to give a snide comment or make fun of these men or accuse them of something, really, they were giving them really the greatest compliment that could ever be given, right? And it really speaks to the power of the gospel. Everywhere these men go, they change the world. Everywhere. How do they do it? Well, the same way that we need to do it, by teaching the gospel. In reality, their statement is not even correct. The world was turned upside down in Genesis chapter 3. You see, God created the world a certain way. And when He looked down upon it, He said it was good after every day. And it was good, and it was good, and it was good. Read Genesis chapter 1. The only time that changes is after the creation of mankind. And then it changes from good to what? Very good. And so God made everything perfect. And then we come along and we get to Genesis chapter 3. And what changes? Well, that old tempter comes along, right? And Adam and Eve sin. Yes, it's both Adam and Eve. Actually, if you want to single out one, we can't single out the women, men. Paul makes that clear in 1 or 2 Timothy. She was confused, but Adam was not. And he stood there and still partook. That is the first, but certainly not the last time that major problems have come from weak men. Keep going. Abraham does the same thing. He listens to his wife. Problems arise. Adam, he didn't listen to God. He listened to his wife. He was a weak man, and problems came out from it. And so, the world was actually turned upside down in Genesis chapter 3. Finally, we're at the point where the gospel is changing the world back. And that's what really we need to do. We need to be like these men. Everywhere we go, we need to proclaim the gospel. And if we do, the world will be a better place. Then their accusation really is partly true and partly false. Notice that they say that they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. As a matter of fact, Christians are submissive to the laws of the land, right? We'll see 1 Peter chapter 2. So that part was really false. But the second part, in which that they pledged allegiance to another king, is absolutely true. Who is our king right now? Jesus. He's on the throne. Nobody can ever take that away. He is reigning on the throne, and He is our king. And so, once the city authorities noticed this, they were disturbed, and they sought to take money from Jason as a security. This would have been like our bail, I guess, our bond. And so, really, it was a deposit put down to basically say, hey, we're not going to cause any more trouble, basically, okay? And so that's what happened. And so they gave the money and they let them go. I wonder, when you get to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, round about verse 18, Paul says that the devil, even though Paul has great love for this church in Thessalonica, and he has a great desire to return to them, he says the devil has prevented it. I wonder if this is why. Because when they put that deposit down, basically they were saying that you're not going to be able to come back. And so I wonder if that's what the devil was using to prevent Paul from going back to Thessalonica. At any rate, they're going to be escorted out of town. And notice verse 10. Excuse me. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. There we have it again. They're following their pattern. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. So we get to Berea. Of course, we've all been impressed with these noble Bereans before, right? Now, what does it mean to be noble? Really, originally it was a term meant for a high-born person, right? Somebody who was born with influence, right? Born into a wealthy family, that type of idea. That's certainly not what's being talked about here. It's talking about someone who is noble-minded, someone who has an honest intellect, someone who has an honest heart, someone who is open to the truth. That's the type of people that is being described here in Berea. Those are the type of Jews that Paul and Silas are going to be dealing with here. Now notice why they were noble-minded. What did they do? They, number one, received the word with what? All eagerness. What's another word for eagerness? Readiness? Yep, that's a good one. There's also another word that we could apply here. Cheerfulness. How many of you in here right now are cheerful about receiving the word? I had one hand go up. That's good. Hey, all right, a few. That's good. Are we like these Bereans? Do we receive the word cheerfully, with eagerness? Do we long for it? 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter writes that we should long for the spiritual milk like newborn babies. How many of you in here have been around a newborn baby? Do they make themselves known that they need their milk from their mama? Yeah, they do, don't they? Why? Because it's necessary for their survival. What's necessary for our survival? Absolutely. The milk of the Word, the meat of the Word, right? So do we receive the Word with eagerness? Do we live like this is necessary for our salvation, for our survival? So then they also go on and they examine the Scriptures, how often? Daily, right? Be honest with you. If I were not teaching, I wonder if I would touch my Bible daily. That's one of the reasons I like to teach, because it forces me to do this every single day, literally every single day. I can't afford not to. I have an uber fear of not being prepared. It goes back to school, and it's just a terrible fear. And so every day I have to try to prepare. But I wonder if I didn't teach, would I be like these Bereans? Would I examine the Scriptures daily? That idea of examining is Paul's presenting the lesson, and they're taking their Scriptures and they're saying, yep, that matches that. That's what that says. Oh, what about over here? Yep, that matches that. Okay, let me go back here. That matches that. They're searching it. They are thoroughly examining what Paul is saying based off of the Scriptures. And they do it daily. And so while Paul was back in Thessalonica, he gives us a perfect example of how we are to teach the Word. And now we get to Berea, and we have these noble-minded Jews. And what do they teach us? They teach us the perfect way to receive the Word. I don't care who's up here. I try my hardest to never say anything incorrect. But is it possible that I could say something incorrect? Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. What about Mr. Gary? Or anybody else? Derek? I know them well enough to know they try their hardest to never say anything incorrect. But is it possible? Yeah. Well, how are you going to know? That's right. We need to be like the Bereans. We examine the Scriptures daily. And so there's the challenge before us. And in response to that, because they did that, notice verse 12, many of them therefore believed, they were obedient, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. Verse 13, but when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, I'm sorry. They came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. This would be similar back to Acts chapter 14, when Paul and Barnabas, I think at the time, Paul and Barnabas went to Lystra. They had been in Antioch and Iconium, and they were run out of those towns, and they were teaching in Lystra. And what did the Jews from Antioch and Iconium do? They came running to Lystra, and they stirred up the crowd and actually stoned Paul. And so it's kind of a similar situation here. Things were going well in Berea. The Jews heard about it in Thessalonica. They didn't like it, and so they came running. And verse 14, then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Paul seems to be the focus of the punishment because Silas and Timothy were able to stay there. Now, we don't know when Timothy got back here in this situation. The text does not reveal it to us, but at some point obviously traveled and met them in Berea. And so Silas and Timothy stayed here, assuming the role of caretakers for the new congregation to try to help encourage them. And Paul was escorted away. And so verse 15, those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. And so the noble Bereans, not only did they receive what Paul said and obeyed it, but when he needed to be escorted out of town, some of them went with him. That's what the idea of those who conducted Paul. Some of them went with him. And they went all the way to Athens. And so that's where we have Paul now. Paul, for the first time since being sent out in Acts chapter 13 with Barnabas, is going to be all alone. He's alone in a huge city. Athens was a magnificent city during its day. Now, at this point in time, really its glory is on the downhill. Now, it's still a great city, but its former glory, it's in the past. They are kind of going down the hill. But what is significant about Athens? Well, it's a big university city. It was one of the 3 major university cities of the world at that time. Another one being Alexandria in Egypt, and another one actually being where Paul was from in Tarsus. But we have a big university here. And it's a magnificent city. This is where a lot of the thinkers would go, the philosophers, the artists, all these types of people would gather in Athens to help stimulate each other and encourage each other and come up with something new. We'll see that in just a moment. But what was also very prevalent in this city? Idols, that's right. Yeah, we'll see that. Verse 16, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked. What does that idea of provoked mean? Angered. Okay, that's a good one. Agitated. That was his response to the sin that was around him. He was agitated. What about me and you? Do you think we've gotten a little too comfortable with sin? Does it agitate you? Maybe even anger you? I'm not saying, I don't think Paul was angry at the people. I think he was angry at the work of the devil. Okay? There is a big difference. But he was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. Now, how full was it? Well, some historical documents help us understand that. It is said that at this time, there were some 30,000 idols in Athens. And there were only 10,000 inhabitants. And so for every one human being, there were 3 idols. And so it was just everywhere. Everywhere you turned, there was a false idol, a temple dedicated to a false idol. Everywhere, right? And so that's the atmosphere that Paul is in. And he's looking around, and can you just imagine the disgust? They're clueless. They don't have any idea what they are doing. And so he's agitated. Now, what is Paul's response to the agitation? Verse 17, so he reasoned in the synagogue. What's Paul's response to everything? He teaches. That's his response to everything. He teaches. And so he reasoned. That's the same word we talked about just a moment ago. in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. That would be Greeks who are not proselytes but God-fearers, okay? And in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. And so on the Sabbath days, he was able to go into the synagogue and teach. Well, what was he doing if it wasn't a Sabbath day? He was going into the marketplace and telling everyone around about Jesus. Now, in that time, this city would have been full of people of the philosophical mindset. And Luke records for us specifically two groups of philosophers that come up and talk to Paul. Notice verse 18, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. Now I have for you on your notes, let's see, in Acts 17:18a, a little information about these two groups of philosophy, Epicurean and Stoics. I'm not going to go through that because I don't have time to do that. But if you read through there, that may help you understand some of the type of people that Paul was talking to here. I do want to highlight just some of the commonalities, though, that these two groups had. Both of them exalted man and his capabilities. In other words, they believed their focus was on the flesh, on man's abilities, his desires. The other one was focused on self-discipline, all these type things. And so the emphasis was on man. Neither acknowledged a need for a personal God. Neither believed in consciousness after death. Neither one of them did. That's why in just a moment, when Paul proclaims Jesus as being resurrected from the dead, some of them mocked him. They didn't believe that. But then notice both were uncomfortable with dogmatic statements concerning the truth. Boy, what does that sound like? Sounds like our world today, doesn't it? Nobody wants to hear the truth. Nobody wants to admit that there is the truth. Everyone likes to say, "Oh, this is my truth," right? "Oh, I'm gonna live according to my truth." Well, there's no such thing as your truth. There is only the truth. The world's uncomfortable with that idea. And so we're in a similar situation as Paul came up against here in Athens. And so notice what he did. Keep going in verse 18. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Does anybody's translation say idle babbler? Well, that's the idea. They were basically saying he's worthless. A babbler literally was a description of a bird who would pick up his seed here and then go somewhere else and pick up his seed, and they would just go around picking up various seeds, and they would put it all together, and that's how they would get their meal. And so what these philosophers are claiming about Paul is that Paul just got his idea from this person here, got another idea from this person over here, so forth and so on, and then he meshed it all together and came up with his own doctrine. That's what he's saying. They were basically saying that he was not an original thinker, right? And so that's the claim that is brought up against Paul. But others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Notice that they said that he is preaching foreign divinities, plural. Most likely, when they heard about Jesus and the resurrection, they associated Jesus as one deity and resurrection as another deity. That's probably what they thought originally. So verse 19, and they took hold of him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting." The Areopagus, we also have referred to it as, anybody? Mars Hill, right? It was a hill there in Athens, and that seems to be where they took Paul. And so they were wanting to know more about this new teaching. Were they wanting to know from a sincere heart? Well, it appears not. Verse 20, "For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Notice what Luke comments. "Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new." They weren't really interested in hearing the truth. They were just interested in hearing something different, just something new. "Oh, that sounds cool. Let me hear about that." And so it doesn't seem that they had very honest intentions in bringing Paul before the Areopagus and getting him to present a lesson. However, Paul is going to take that opportunity. Verse 22, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. Some translations could say very superstitious. I think the Old King James says that. That is actually accurate. That's one thing that Paul could have been saying, that they were superstitious. They would have not taken that in the way that we would. They would not have necessarily taken that as a negative. But my English Standard Version translate that as very religious. That's not inaccurate either. Verse 23, For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Why do they have an altar that was dedicated to the unknown God? Got to cover all your bases, right? They had introduced so many idols that apparently there was a law against introducing another new one. And so they just covered all their bases and say, we're just going to put one here to the unknown God. Now, it's important to recognize Paul is not saying that you have been worshiping Jehovah. He's not saying that. He's really playing on the words that they have presented with him to the unknown God. What he's saying is, there is a God that you don't know anything about. I want to tell you about him. And so that's what Paul is going to do. Verse 24, the God, notice he says, the God. God is separate, right? It is the God. That's what Paul starts with. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. What did their gods, how are their gods in existence? They couldn't do anything for them, right? Because the people had made the gods. Well, the God did what? He made us. And so right away, Paul is really contradicting everything that they know about. And so the God who made the world and everything in it, because he is creator, because he made everything, he is Lord. What does that word mean? He is owner. He is the master. He is sovereign. He is the creator over everything. Therefore, he is the owner of everything. Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. This is a similar idea to Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7. Remember, even the Jews were so attached to the temple, right? That they believed that's where the presence of God was. And that he could only be attached to that temple. Where does Stephen start his speech? With God calling Abraham. God was able to reveal himself to Abraham in Ur of the Chaldeans. Guess what? That is not in the temple. And so, in a similar fashion, Paul is telling these people that, hey, the creator of the universe is not held down by a physical temple. He can't be. He is outside of time, space, and matter. Therefore, he cannot be confined to a temple that is made by man. Verse 25, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Now, this is interesting. So, these idols that were being worshipped in Athens were made by men, and then they had to be sustained by man. In other words, they would actually bring food and offer it to the idol. They would bring water and offer it to the idol as if the idol needed their service. Well, what does Paul say? The God is the one who gives us life. God doesn't need me. I need God. That's what Paul is saying. Now, there's an important implication here. Does God need my service? Does God need my worship? No. If I don't worship him this morning, God's not going to change. He's not. So what is worship? Who is worship really for? Why does he tell us to do that? It helps us. That's what our worship does. It helps us. Our service to God, it helps us. God doesn't need it. We're the ones that need it. We need it like we need the breath that he provides for us. Verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. When it says, and he made from one man, some translations say from one blood. Scientifically, that is actually pretty accurate. There is hardly any difference between the blood of one man and the blood of another man. And so scientifically, that's actually pretty accurate. And so not only did we not create God, but God is the one who made one man, and from that one man, he was able to create great nations. Israel was not the only great nation that God made. The Edomites ended up being a great nation. All these different nations in the Old Testament, they were great because that's what God did. Now, were they good? No, not necessarily. But God was the one that was responsible for them being formed, for their boundaries being set, not just physical boundaries, like the oceans, right? The oceans form our physical boundaries, right? But also political boundaries, right? Daniel chapter 4 teaches us what? I think 3 or 4 times we read in Daniel chapter 4 that God rules in the kingdoms of men. 3 or 4 times. If you got a problem with who's president right now, you know what? God's not worried about it. He's got it under control. That's what this verse is saying. God is in control. If you have a problem with the president now, or if you like the president now, you probably didn't like the one before. Guess what? Doesn't bother God. I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't bother God the way they behave. What I am saying is it's not going to change God. It's not going to affect His will. He's going to be able to carry out His will based off of whoever is sitting in the White House or who else is ruling in the world. We need to remember that. God is the one that's in control of everything. Verse 27, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward Him and find Him, yet He is actually not far from each one of us. I want to make one comment on this verse, and we're going to stop. All that God has done, His creation of us, His formation of mankind, His ability to affect His will throughout all of history and even into today, is for what purpose? Notice what he says, that they, mankind, should seek God. One of the questions that people always struggle with is, what is the purpose of life? Paul just provided it for us. What is our purpose? To seek after God. That is the only purpose that we have. If we do that, everything else is going to be taken care of. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, after he looked at all that he had done in his life, he said, all is vanity, it's worthless, it's striving after the wind. It was a waste of my time. And he said the only thing that matters is to fear God and keep His commandments. All right, we're going to stop there. We're going to pick up in verse 28 and get into, we'll get through chapter 18 next week, Lord willing.